Hi everyone, welcome. I've got a bin over here. It's 35 days of age, but it's not the bin that we're going to be working on today. I'm only bringing our attention to it because the worms that live in here left behind a whole bunch of castings that I placed into another bus box. I could have simply just treated those castings as harvested, put them into storage, and forgotten about them. But I didn't want to because when I was working on this stuff, it seemed to me like it was loaded with cocoons. And that's the reason I put them in this box over here. And then even later on, only 9 days ago, I had harvested a couple other systems. After I harvested those systems, I used the worms that I collected out of them and I launched off some breeder buckets. Those breeder buckets are off to the left over here, but we're not here to talk about the breeder buckets. We're here to talk about these castings. So the castings that got loaded in here 9 days ago, those I didn't really see so many cocoons in, but I knew for a fact that there were a lot of straggler worms left behind that didn't get rounded up to get loaded into the buckets. They remained in the castings. So between the baby worms that have probably hatched by now out of the cocoons I saw in the material 35 days ago, as well as the straggler worms that were still in this stuff when we harvested the material 9 days ago, I was almost certain that we should be able to round up some worms from these systems here. And that's why I just combined it all into one spot, and what I did was I set up a couple bait boxes. So the bait boxes just have some fresh damp bedding, a little bit of pumpkin in there, and those were set up a day after I loaded all the material into here. I came back off camera 8 days ago to set those bait boxes up, and I even had a little extra material over here as well. And I set up a similar baiting setup over here in this plastic box. I figured we would check all the baiting boxes to see if we can round up some worms. And when we do, luckily, I've got a pre-built box, a pre-built bin sitting here on standby. You can see it's got no label on it. It's all set to go. Imagine, it's been here for 77 days. So the material in this stuff has been aging for 77 days. Should definitely be comfortable for worms to be moved into. So let's see how those baiting efforts are coming along. I'm going to put on a glove. We're going to get these little guys up on the bench and we're going to get to work. We'll begin down here in this smaller green container. And if you were with me 9 days ago when we did that harvest of the two bins from which we recruited the breeders, then you'll know that the stuff that I kind of treated as problematic, which didn't really register in my book as nice, pure, clean, ready-to-go castings, like what we put into the bus box over there. This stuff was a little bit more clumpy, kind of stuck together boulders, and at this point, the stuff's just been sitting out here drying. Now they're kind of like little hard rocks. But hopefully the material down a little bit lower is a little bit softer and perhaps is dried out to the point where maybe some of those little boulders can actually get kind of rolled around in my hands and broken apart. And a lot of times these little boulders really just collect around some sort of a little chunk of food scrap or bedding bit or whatever. So whatever, we're not so much interested in the brown stuff. What we're interested in is the pink stuff, the little pink worms that are hopefully in this box here. And I guess before we turn our attentions to how many, if any, worms we managed to round up, I thought we would take a look through here. And I'm definitely accepting the fact that we might have a few stragglers. And we'll pick those out one by one unless we start seeing a huge number of them. So let's just keep this right here so we can place them in here as we encounter them, if we encountered any more. My hope is that they've made their way, all of them at least. Well, not all of them, because we already found one that wasn't in there. My hope was that we would almost find every single worm in the plastic box in the baiting station. I guess the fact that we found one odd man out, it's not a big deal. I did almost expect that we would find that this material had been 100% depopulated and the worms had all left. And I believe that is in fact the case here. I'm curious to see if that's going to be the same situation when we get over into the big tub full of the castings. So I think I'm just going to make one more quick round. If we do see any other worms, they would probably be down low, except I've already stirred this stuff up quite a bit at this point. It just seems somewhat unlikely that we would still see any more. I mean, I was a little bit surprised to see one out in this material still, but he was sort of hanging out in a little puddle. Who knows, maybe half of him was already in here, and maybe half of him was just kind of hanging out, taking a peek to see what was still going on outside. But at this point, I think we've got depopulated material. Here it seems like we've got a casualty, a worm that just did not make it and is just in the process of decomposing at this point. So whatever, let's set this aside and let's treat this as a done deal. I'd also like to just simply empty this and get the contents of this out of here. Maybe we'll get a little sneak peek as to how many worms have made their way out. And then we'll take those other two bait boxes and we'll remove the contents of those too. So let's see here. I had sort of put a liner in here, this little napkin, and I punctured it so that there'd be no obstruction so that the worms can get into the baiting station quite readily. And I see 1, I see 2, I see 3, I see 4, 5, and I even see a little leftover bit of pumpkin here. Not a whole lot. And a couple more worms right there next to it. Here's another little piece of leftover food. So it does seem we did manage to rescue a couple worms out of this clumpy material, which is a nice thing to see. So I guess we're going to have to go fetch the bait boxes out of the other container too and see how we did over there. And I suppose over there too we'll remove the bait boxes and once again assess the material to see if there's a lot of stragglers, because I do need to know whether or not I'm going to be resetting the bait boxes to let the process continue or whether we're possibly done with the baiting of the material. So let's go get that other container out here too and see how we did as far as getting the worms out of that stuff. So now, you know, I was beginning to contemplate our options here, whether using that full-size bin, the 77-day-old pre-built bin that I showed you earlier for this endeavor. I mean, who knows, maybe that little green tub that we just verified that there were no more worms in, I could just remove those castings from there. Maybe we'll set that up. But I guess that'll depend on how many worms have come together, and we'll see and decide then. So let's get over to the two little bait boxes that we had set up in this stuff. So now the 35-day-old material, the one, the cocoon, the stuff with the cocoons in it, was pretty damp and nice and cozy. And it seemed to me like, you know, stuff that little baby worms would be in good shape to be born in and to live in until such a time that we got around to collecting them up. I'm also just making sure that we don't have any that are sort of stuck to this piece of plastic, because they do like to come up for the moisture, and the moisture does settle on the plastic. And since we know that a lot of what's in this tub are probably very puny little worms, I don't want to leave them stranded off on the side. So I'm just taking a quick glance across this thing. But you know, if we fold it in half, then the moisture content should remain on here. So if there are any worms, I could check that out later and not take up too much time now, because I guess removing the bait boxes is what's of greatest interest to me. And here and there, if I see a worm, we'll just pick it out individually, and then we'll have a chance to assess how our evacuation effort worked. So once again, before we explore how we did as far as rounding up worms in these two baiting boxes, I'm very interested in just seeing if possibly perhaps the evacuation is complete. So I'm going to try to do this in a really gentle, ginger way, so that if we do spot any itsy bitsy little baby worms that need to be rescued from this material, we'll rescue them. Not that it's imperative that we quote unquote rescue anybody out of anything, because if there's worms remaining in this stuff, I mean, yeah, it's a little bit drier than worms would probably prefer, but probably not so dry that it would be considered hostile for worms to remain in. So I do believe, just from examining this material that was surrounding the baiting box, that there probably are no worms nearby. They probably came within range of that thing, and they could sense the pumpkin in there, they could sense the moisture in there, the nice fresh bedding. They probably just decided, let's go for it, you know, instead of teasing themselves. They just, oh, okay, well, I'm starting to wonder if we could be mistaken. I just saw a couple worms, a couple juvenile worms. So let's make sure we fetch them and bring them over. 1, 2, I saw a third one over here, I believe, and even a fourth one. So perhaps a reset of the baiting station in here would make good sense. Because now that I'm kind of going down a little bit deeper, it did seem like we encountered a couple more worms. I just saw another one. And, you know, finding worms is not all about getting every last one. I believe finding worms at this stage is really just to help with the decision point of, do we continue baiting or do we consider it as complete? And I don't know if it's fair to say at this point that the process is complete. So I'm just going to do one more kind of deeper excavation, going down to the very bottom of the bin, and sometimes I just wonder if maybe that's where the worms are retreating to instead of going after the bait. And I think we've already managed to haul out manually, individually, about 10 worms now, telling me that, you know, it's probably a good bet that we're going to be continuing with the baiting. So I didn't bring food down here. I thought that maybe we would just kind of remain somewhat optimistic and assume that all the worms had made their way into the bait boxes and are now going to be hauled out as a result of this activity. But if it's going to take a little bit more time to get them to come together, that's fine. But I also see no harm in actually grabbing one if I spot one, right? Because we are going to be launching off that 77-day-old bin, or do we? I don't know. I'm not sure if that's going to be maybe overkill. I was actually thinking that after we examine what's coming out of these two bait boxes, maybe we'll decide something a little bit smaller would be suitable to get these little guys started. Or maybe, I'm even wondering if maybe we just add these stragglers to the 35-day-old system I showed you a moment ago in the beginning. Because maybe we don't even have that many, and maybe it would just make a little bit more sense to get them into that other worm bin, and we'll just up the estimated worm count in that system based on how many worms we believe we've collected over here today. So here again, I spotted another one, actually two, and we're going to pull them out, and maybe I'll do one. Here's another one. So yeah, I think I've pretty much verified for myself that continuing with the baiting of worms from this material probably makes pretty good sense. So I'll tend to the reset of these baiting stations, or maybe I'll just set up one baiting station, or maybe all three. I'm not sure how to play it. I'll have to decide later. But I wasn't going to really film all that. I just figured I would do that off camera again like I had in the past. And what we're going to do is examine the bait boxes and see how we did on rounding up worms from this material. So, once again, I'm going to do a little bit of a reset over here, get this thing out of our way, and then we'll do a deeper examination of what's going on in those two bait boxes we pulled out of this stuff. So now, after I return the box full of the castings back over onto the shelf behind me, I was only taking a moment or two to try to level off the castings, and even then I fished out about 3 or 4 more worms. So I think that tells us almost for certain that there's going to be more worms to be rounded up out of that stuff. So let's satisfy our curiosity. These are the baiting boxes in which I believe we're going to see somewhat greater number of worms. I didn't really think that other clear plastic box that we baited worms out of the little collection of boulders, I didn't think we'd see all that much worm activity, but here right away we're already able to, I don't know if they're visible, there's a good number of worms hanging out on the bottom of this little plastic tub already. Let's see if I can scoop them out of here. Some of them are pretty puny, a couple of them are a little bit bigger in size. And I guess the process that we used is probably a key contributor to why there were a lot of stragglers left behind in the material. It was because we tried to separate the worms from their castings just by screening the material. And then we just ended up with a big pile of worms, you know? I mean, yeah, a lot of stuff got caught in the screen with the worms, such as those boulders and other things. So I think we've got most of them. I'd hate to leave any behind. It's just at the very bottom. I could see one, and he's right along the bottom edge. And, well, this isn't crucial. We can fish them out momentarily. Let's set that aside, and maybe we'll just get this out of the way in a minute. You know, I just feel like I want to get them out of here. It's just that getting them out is very tricky. It almost makes me feel like it's time to start using my ungloved hand, where I might have a little bit more dexterity. And there we go. Got them out, 1, 2, 3. So sometimes it's just necessary to use the ungloved hand too. I should really at least keep my pinky clean so I can continue to control the camera with something. And okay, now I think we're in good shape. Let's empty this one too. And then we can explore these little bundles to see what's actually inside of them. Let's get this one out. Here again, just a few worms hanging out. Luckily not as many as the other one had in it. Once again, I think we could simply set it aside, and if there's any stragglers, I can fish them out momentarily. But in this one, I believe we managed to get them all. Nope, one more. Now we've got them all. All right, great. Oh, there's a couple even on the outside here. All right, this is the moment of truth. This is, I guess, what's going to help us decide whether or not we're going to commission a full-size bin, that 77-day-old pre-built bin, or does it make more sense to simply, I don't know, maybe just grab some donor material out of that pre-built bin and commission the little green tub as the place to put these little guys. So now, right away, the pumpkin is clearly a good material to bait worms with, because they love this stuff. And already over here, I could see a good number of them hanging out, consuming this little piece of pumpkin. And I guess, you know, first couple days of these baiting stations being in service probably didn't really gather too many worms, but I'm sure within a day or two these pieces of pumpkin were probably being ravaged. And I'm even wondering if we were to just leave this stuff out here in the light, perhaps the worms would simply evacuate these pieces of pumpkin, and then we could actually reuse these to reset the baiting stations. So there's a good number of worms hanging out here, a mix of different sized worms. Some worms that fell through the screen. I was kind of expecting it to be mainly little tiny worms that fell through the screen, and that the screen had caught I thought that the screen would have caught most of the larger sized worms so that we can use them to launch off the breeder systems. But it's not too unusual. It's not too unusual sometimes to find a larger worm that has snuck through the screen, slipped through. So, I don't know. I am beginning to formulate sort of a guesstimate as far as how many worms I believe are in this stuff. And I am just trying to break open any larger chunks of material, just in case there's little pockets of worms hanging out in it, in between the folds of some paper or whatever. Because like I usually do, since we will be launching a new system today, I really do value everyone's input on providing me with their estimates of how many worms they think they saw, so that when we start the bin, I don't go with any number. I take my own estimate of how many worms I believe we launched the system with, and then I wait to hear the feedback from the viewers to see what all the viewers think they saw, and then I'll average my estimate with the estimate of all the viewers, and that's usually the way we come up with our estimated worm count for all my systems. Been doing that way for a while, and I think that's probably one of the better ways to do it. Kind of factors out any sort of biases or any sort of extreme guesses. Some people put in a guess that's extremely low, a guess that's extremely high. Those sort of cancel each other out, and then what you're left with is usually a much more realistic figure. So here too, we're just going to do what we can to try to get a good view of how many worms have come together for this. Here too, little jumbles of worms. Got to factor in the consideration of the size of these little guys, because so many of them are puny little tiny worms, juveniles, babies. A lot of them probably born out of the castings from the cocoons that went with those castings that were placed into the tub 35 days ago. Some of these larger guys might have just slipped through the screening process that we did 9 days ago to launch the breeder systems. So it is a little bit of a mix, but mainly small-sized worms, with a couple larger ones mixed in here or there. So it does seem like we've got ourselves a good few chunks of pumpkin, which I believe will probably be, for the most part, worm-free in a few minutes. Once the worms start to dislike being out here in these bright lights and start to squirm down into the bedding below. And then I think this stuff will be like prime material with which we can reset some sort of a baiting solution, which I'm not going to do on camera at this point. I'll just do that after the fact. So I think I'm just going to ponder my options here in terms of where we want to put these little guys. I am starting to lean towards using the green tub, because it just seems to me like that should be adequate for this many worms. Doesn't seem like it's necessary to launch off an entire full-size bin, although I'm wondering if I should factor in the size of all these worms. So many little tiny worms. Once they get situated, once they start eating, we're going to end up with a bunch of adult worms that might appear to be a whole lot more than what we see here. It might be a little bit deceiving because they are mainly tiny little worms. I don't know. Let me see what I could do about getting these little guys off my glove. And then we'll have to pick up where I left off, which is really just to give these worms a new home, get them launched off. Like I said, I'll be resetting those bait boxes off screen. So I keep trying to remove worms from the material I can see myself wanting to reuse in the bait boxes. And these two large chunks of newspaper seem like ideal bits of material to be reused. So leaving them out here in the bright lights is probably a good idea, and unfolding them is probably a good idea too. Alright. I think it's break time, and I gotta go toss a coin or figure out what I'm gonna do next. So I took a few moments there to reset the bait boxes and to get the castings material set back up with those bait boxes and covered back up and continuing now. And I made my decision. I flipped a coin and I decided that we're going to go with the black box, the 11-week-old, 77-day-old pre-built box that was up on the frame over there, on the Vermibag frame, and along with the worms that are in here in this little round container, we're going to just also chuck in all this material here. It's mainly finished castings, but it's also probably finished castings that are clumped up on top of little bits of residual chunks of leftover food or bedding bits. So we'll just throw it into that new system along with the worms to get worked down. And I even took the time to prepare a nice new label. So let's not wait any longer. Let's get those little guys over here and get them introduced into their nice new home. Okay. It's about time, you know. 11 weeks sitting around Although it's not exactly true. I actually had the bin that I started my 35-day-old system in, and right before launching that off as a new system, I took half the material and I split it and I put more bedding with it, and then I put the other half in here, added more bedding, so half the material in here is 77 days old. The rest of it is only maybe 5 weeks old or something like that. So there is there's even a little bit of standing water at the bottom of this thing. Alrighty. Almost makes me wonder if that would be a good reason to come back in here with perhaps a little bit of just even more fresh bedding, dry fresh bedding. And if I were to just tip this thing over, it does seem like a couple cups worth of water would collect over here, or maybe even just some of this drier stuff out on the surface. It just seems like we've got material here that's perhaps a little bit more damp than it needs to be for a worm bin. I've been getting a little bit overzealous, I believe, with applying the BTI mosquito dunks solution in all my systems, and that includes this new system here too. Not wanting to come in here someday to load worms and finding that it had already been occupied by a bunch of flying insects. But as far as tipping this thing over, letting the water drain to one corner, and then sopping it up with some nice fresh dry bedding, that's something I could do later. I think right now we've got to get these little worms out of their little cramped quarters here, out of this little round tub, this little pile of bedding material, and just get them loose in their new home. So I got a feeling they're going to really like this. And you know what? Before we do that, I'm also just going to introduce all this castings material so that it can also help inoculate this new system. Not to say that it even needs a whole lot of that. I'm sure that this system's quite good as far as housing all kinds of microbes and bacteria and who knows what else, so that the worms should feel pretty at home in here. But I just figured let's get that stuff in here so that at the end, once the worms have been released, we'll be more or less done. We won't have any loose ends. All we'll have to do is cover up and put away and apply our sticker to Christen. This is our newest system. So without any further ado, although you know what, I'm going to leave a little section over here so that at the end I could take care of sopping up the excess moisture with some nice additional fresh bedding over there. Perhaps some leaves, perhaps some shredded paper and cardboard, or whatever. Let's get the wormies released into their new home. Here we go. Maybe I'll see what I could do about perhaps disturbing this pile a little bit so that we can even get one more last look at how many worms we've just released into here. And don't forget, I'm going to be looking for everyone's input on how many worms it is that we've just started this new system with. And I do value everyone's input, and I do factor in everyone's contributions on estimating the number of worms. So after a week or two, after all the comments have settled down, and I've got everyone's input, I'll average the number and announce it. But for now, let's let these little guys get settled in, and then we can put the label on. Okay, so I'm coming in here with a little bit of this fresh, pretty much sterile, dry bedding. I had just shredded up a bunch of cardboard and paper the other day, and then I went ahead and I replenished my pre-made bedding supply, and in there I add moisture, I add leaves, and this stuff was just extra, so I figured I'd leave it sitting around. It's kind of nice to have some dry material laying around with which I can scrape off the damp stuff that's stuck to my glove and then position that stuff down here on the edge so that we can tip up the box and let the fluid drain over into that side and get sucked up by all that stuff. And I'll take care of covering up and putting away later. But before we call it quits on the video, there's just one last order of business, and I think a lot of you know what it is. I think it's going to be evident in a moment. It's time to christen our newest bin here. A new bin of red wigglers, and that makes it official. So please, don't forget, I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's input on how many worms you think we just released into the system. And like I said, I'll always average everyone's information together into a combined number, and that'll become the estimated size of the population of worms that lives in the system. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. So now how do I tip this thing up so it can start draining? Let's do it like that. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.